The most dangerous number in this war right now is not a casualty count. It is a distance, 5,000 kilometers. Because if that number is real, then the map of this conflict just changed. What began as a brutal regional war is now flirting with something far bigger, a missile threat that could stretch far beyond Israel, beyond the Gulf, and deep into Europe. And that is why the latest American strikes matter so much. They were not just retaliation. They were a warning shot against what Washington appears to believe Iran is becoming. For years, Iran insisted that it had imposed limits on its own missile program, that it did not need weapons with truly long range, that 2,000 kilometers was enough. That number became part of the diplomatic wallpaper of the Middle East. It was repeated so often that many people stopped questioning it. But wars have a way of exposing the difference between what countries say and what they have actually built. And now, after a new wave of strikes, missile launches, interceptions, and intelligence assessments, the central question is no longer whether Iran can threaten its neighborhood. Everybody already knew that. The question now is whether Iran has quietly crossed into a category that forces military planners in Washington, London, Berlin, and beyond to think about a very different kind of deterrence problem. What makes this moment so serious is the timing. U.S. Central Command has confirmed repeated nights of strikes on Iranian military targets, including command centers, drone facilities, communications networks, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime capabilities tied to the threat against shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. That tells you something important right away. The United States is not just reacting to missiles already in the air. It is trying to break the system that supports them before the next stage of the threat fully matures. In military terms, that is the difference between interception and suppression. Interception is defense. Suppression is an admission that defense alone may not be enough. And then there is the event that pulled this missile debate out of the world of theory and into the headlines. Reports in March said Iran launched missiles toward Diego Garcia, the joint U.S.-UK base in the Indian Ocean. If accurate, that was no routine strike. Diego Garcia sits roughly 3,800 to 4,000 kilometers from Iran, depending on launch point and trajectory. In other words, if Iranian missiles were truly aimed that far, then the old 2,000-kilometer ceiling was already obsolete. That does not automatically mean Iran suddenly possesses a polished, reliable intercontinental arsenal. It does mean the assumptions built around its limits no longer look safe. This is where the story gets even more unsettling. Some analysts believe the most likely explanation is not that Iran unveiled a totally new miracle weapon overnight, but that it used existing technology more cleverly than many expected. A missile like the Khorramshahr, for example, may be able to travel much farther if it carries a lighter payload. That sounds technical, but the concept is simple. The less weight a missile has to haul, the farther it can go. The trade-off is destructive power. A lighter warhead may not devastate a hardened base the way a larger one would. But that does not mean the launch is meaningless. In strategy, proving range can be almost as important as proving damage. Sometimes the political message is the weapon, and that message is what has everybody paying attention to the 5,000-kilometer figure. Iran has spent years presenting parts of its space program as civilian and scientific. On paper, that sounds familiar. Satellite launch vehicles, orbital projects, national prestige, technological development. But military analysts have warned for a long time that space launch technology and long-range missile technology are cousins. They are not identical, but they share a lot of the same engineering. Large rocket motors, stage separation, propulsion, guidance, heat management, manufacturing tolerance. Once a country masters enough of those disciplines, the line between launching a payload into space and throwing a warhead across continents starts looking less like a wall and more like a doorway. That is why systems like the Zuljanah matter so much. Iran Watch and other analysts have noted that if a space launch vehicle of that class were reconfigured as a ballistic system, its theoretical reach could move into the 4,000 to 5,000 kilometer category. The word theoretical matters. It means analysts are not claiming Iran has rolled out a fully operational 5,000-kilometer combat missile in neat production numbers. It means the physics, the motors, the design logic, and the accumulated experience point in that direction. And in military planning, theoretical capability stops being academic the moment a war starts rewarding risk. Now think about how that changes the strategic map. At 2,000 kilometers, Iran is a dangerous regional missile power. At 4,000, it can create anxiety across much of Europe. At 5,000, the psychological effect becomes even larger. Suddenly, this is not just about Gulf bases, Israeli cities, or shipping corridors. It becomes a debate about whether Iran has entered the outer edge of true long-range deterrence, not necessarily with accuracy and reliability equal to major nuclear powers, but with enough reach to force other countries to spend money, reposition assets, expand missile defense, and make decisions under uncertainty. That is often how these shifts happen. Not with one clean moment of proof, but with a series of disturbing clues that gradually make the old framework impossible to defend. And uncertainty is exactly what Tehran can exploit. A missile does not need perfect accuracy to complicate the calculations of its enemies. It needs enough credibility that no leader wants to be the one who guessed wrong. That is why range matters even when payload, guidance, and survivability remain under debate. It is why an attempted long-distance strike can alter alliances even if it misses. It is why military planners worry not just about what hit, but about what nearly hit, what might hit next time, and what could eventually be mass-produced underground where surveillance becomes harder and preemption gets riskier. That underground piece is critical. Modern wars often create a misleading impression that air power can simply erase a weapons program if enough bombs fall on enough buildings. Reality is messier. Countries under intense pressure adapt. Facilities are buried deeper. Production is dispersed. Mobile launchers are hidden. Components are stockpiled. Command chains are simplified. The result is that a missile force can become smaller on the surface while becoming more survivable underneath it. That is one reason Washington's recent strikes focused not only on launch-related targets, but also on communications, surveillance, and maritime infrastructure. When an adversary's visible military posture is damaged, the invisible systems start to matter even more. And this war is not just about land strikes. It is also about choke points. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth because so much of the world's energy supply passes through it. Even when the water is technically open, the threat environment can still throttle traffic. Insurance rates surge. Captains hesitate. Companies reroute. Delays stack up. Oil traders start pricing fear, not just supply. Recent reporting has shown how quickly oil moved higher as U.S. Iran fighting intensified, and traffic through Hormuz fell sharply from pre-war levels. That matters to American viewers more than they may realize. A missile launch in the Gulf does not stay in the Gulf. It can show up at a U.S. gas station, in airline fuel costs, in shipping rates, in inflation, and in the stock market. Then add the Bab el-Mandeb into the equation, the southern gateway to the Red Sea. If Hormuz is pressure point number 1, Bab el-Mandeb is pressure point number 2. When Houthi threats or attacks slow traffic there too, global commerce starts losing flexibility. Tankers and container ships can reroute, but rerouting costs time and money, and not every industry can absorb that gracefully. So now this war is not merely a duel of missiles and airstrikes. It is a contest over geography itself, over narrow waterways that connect continents, over whether the world economy can remain insulated from military escalation in one of the most combustible regions on Earth. That widening is showing up politically too. Saudi Arabia, after months of trying to avoid direct entanglement, has now been drawn more openly into operations against Iran-backed groups in Iraq, alongside the United States. That is a meaningful shift. Saudi leaders understand that once you move from indirect pressure to visible strikes, you are accepting the risk of retaliation not only against military positions but against economic infrastructure. Oil facilities, desalination plants, airports, shipping nodes, pipelines, all become candidates in the escalation ladder. And Iran knows exactly where those vulnerabilities are because asymmetric pressure has long been one of the pillars of its regional strategy. Jordan is another warning sign. Recent attacks linked to the conflict struck the Muwafaq Salti Air Base area, and Jordan's military has reported intercepting multiple incoming missiles. Even when defenses work, each interception is a cost. Interceptors are expensive. Radar coverage is finite. Readiness is exhausting. Allied militaries can absorb that pressure for a while, but the math gets uncomfortable if attacks become more frequent, more complex, or more maneuverable. That is the hidden story in missile warfare. One side can sometimes force the other into a draining economic and logistical contest simply by making defense expensive and offense comparatively cheaper. And this is where technology becomes more important than rhetoric. If Iran is improving not just range but also survivability, maneuverability, decoys, and terminal performance, then every additional kilometer matters even more. A long-range missile that flies predictably is one thing. A long-range missile that complicates interception is another. Even modest improvements in guidance or re-entry behavior can force defenders to rethink everything from sensor placement to interceptor inventory to the timing of engagement. It is one thing to say, we can shoot them down. It is another to say, we can do it every time, at scale, across multiple fronts, for months. History offers a useful warning here. States rarely announce the true edge of their strategic capability the moment they achieve it. More often, they conceal, blur, exaggerate, understate, and signal selectively depending on what best serves them politically. The Soviet Union did it, the United States did it, North Korea has done it, China does it in its own way. Iran is not unique in understanding that ambiguity can be useful. If anything, ambiguity may be central to the strategy. If adversaries cannot tell whether a capability is experimental, deployable, or already operational in limited numbers, they must prepare for all three. That forces them into the most expensive version of caution. But there is another layer to this story that often gets lost in the hardware talk, and it is the one that matters most in the long run. Missile programs are not built just to fire weapons. They are built to shape diplomacy. Iran's leaders understand that a state under military pressure still gains leverage if it can convince opponents that escalation could become broader, more expensive, and more unpredictable. In that sense, the 5,000-kilometer discussion is not just about engineering. It is about bargaining power. It is about trying to raise the perceived cost of continued attacks. It is about sending the message that even if Iran is weakened conventionally, it still has cards left to play. The problem is that this logic cuts both ways. The more Iran tries to restore deterrence through longer-range missiles and maritime pressure, the more it encourages its adversaries to speed up preemption. Washington and its partners do not want to wait until theory becomes deployment, and deployment becomes routine launch capability. That is why strikes on command networks and military infrastructure may continue even if each night of bombing produces only partial visible results. The objective is cumulative degradation. Not a single knockout blow, but a steady attempt to narrow Iran's options before the technology, the stockpiles, and the regional coordination recover enough to produce a more dangerous phase. So where does this go next? There are several possibilities, and this is where we need to separate confirmed reality from informed analysis. Confirmed reality is that the war has already expanded geographically, that maritime risk remains elevated, that the United States has been striking Iranian military targets, and that long-range questions surrounding Iran's missile capabilities are now impossible to ignore. Analysis begins when we ask whether Tehran will try again to demonstrate extended reach, whether European governments will treat that as a direct strategic problem rather than a distant regional one, and whether regional partners such as Saudi Arabia and Jordan will harden their own positions rather than stepping back. If Iran attempts another long-range launch, even a failed one, the political consequences could be enormous. One more demonstration toward a distant base or across a wider arc of geography might be enough to convince more governments that the issue is no longer hypothetical. On the other hand, if Tehran holds back, it may preserve some ambiguity while avoiding a direct trigger for an even larger coalition response. That is the paradox. A regime may want the fear generated by a capability without the risks that come from proving it too clearly. For Europe, this could become a turning point. A war that once felt geographically contained starts looking different when military analysts openly discuss whether European capitals sit inside a broader envelope of risk. Even if current Iranian systems remain inaccurate or lightly armed at extreme distances, the strategic conversation shifts the moment planners conclude that the technological pathway is real. Missile defense, basing posture, intelligence priorities, naval deployments, and diplomacy all start adjusting around that judgment. Once that happens, it is very hard to go back to pretending the problem is only regional. And for the United States, the stakes are even wider. Washington is not only defending bases and allies, it is defending the credibility of its security architecture across the Middle East. If American forces can protect shipping, maintain access, suppress missile infrastructure, and reassure nervous partners, U.S. influence holds. If not, every regional actor starts quietly recalculating. Some may hedge, some may arm faster. Some may seek accommodation with whichever power looks hardest to dislodge. That is why this is not just a story about one missile estimate. It is a story about whether the balance of fear in the region is changing. In the end, the most important point is also the simplest. The 5,000-kilometer debate matters not because one number magically transforms Iran into a superpower, but because it exposes how quickly the boundaries of a war can move. A conflict that began as a fight over influence, deterrence, and regional power has expanded into a contest over range, choke points, alliance credibility, and global economic stability. The missiles themselves are frightening enough, but the deeper danger is what they represent, a war that keeps discovering new ways to get bigger. And that is why the latest strikes should be understood for what they really are. Not just retaliation, not just punishment, but an attempt to stop a strategic transition before it fully locks into place. Because once a country proves that it can threaten farther, survive longer, and pressure more fronts at once, every future negotiation starts from a different baseline. And once that baseline changes, wars become much easier to widen than to end. If you want more deep, no-hype breakdowns on the wars, weapons, and power struggles shaping the world right now, subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop your take in the comments. Do you think Iran's long-range missile reach is still mostly a bluff? Or are we watching the birth of a much bigger deterrence threat in real time?